In the autumn of 1872, in a forgotten corner of Massachusetts, stood the St. Aurelia Asylum for the Demented and Afflicted. It was a place of supposed mercy, a sanctuary built of cold stone and colder faith. But within its walls, a different kind of gospel took root, one that twisted the sanctity of birth into an act of profound violation. The matron, a woman of unshakable piety, believed she was guided by God's own voice, and she would use her own sons as instruments to fulfill a holy mandate, turning the wombs of her patients into altars for a terrifying new covenant, one that would be written in blood and sanctified by madness. If the quiet darkness of the past is where you feel most at home, and you are new to this archive, subscribe now and join our vigil over the histories that were meant to be buried. The journey itself was a form of isolation. Dr. Elias Wren felt the world shrink with every turn of the carriage wheels, the dense woods of rural Massachusetts closing in around him like a verdant cage. He was a man of science, a student of the mind's new and burgeoning pathologies, trained in the city hospitals, where progress was measured in clinical trials and the steady march of secular reason. The crisp autumn air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, did little to clear his head of the lingering skepticism that had accompanied him since accepting the post. He had read the literature on St. Aurelia Asylum, of course. It was lauded in certain circles as a revolutionary model of moral treatment, a place where the chaotic minds of the afflicted were soothed not by restraints and hydrotherapy, but by structure, prayer, and the unwavering guidance of its director, Matron Agatha Pell. The accounts described her as a visionary, a widow whose profound grief had been transformed into a holy calling. She had, according to the pamphlets, received divine visions that instructed her to build this sanctuary, a place where God's most broken children could find peace. The doctor clutched his leather satchel, the cool metal of his diagnostic tools, a small comfort against the encroaching strangeness of his new reality. He was a physician, not a priest, and he harbored a deep-seated mistrust of any healing that relied more on scripture than on science. As the carriage broke through the final curtain of trees, the asylum came into view. It was not the decrepit, Gothic monstrosity he might have imagined. Instead, St. Aurelia was a stark, imposing structure of granite, its lines clean and severe, more akin to a monastery than a hospital. Its windows were tall and narrow, like the watchful eyes of a judgmental god, and a single, unadorned cross rose from the apex of its central roof. The grounds were meticulously kept, the lawns trimmed with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. There was an unnerving quiet to the place, broken only by the crunch of the gravel drive and the distant, almost imperceptible echo of a hymn being sung within its walls. The very air seemed heavy with a kind of ordered tranquility, a silence that felt less like peace and more like suppression. Dr. Wren stepped out of the carriage, his city boots feeling clumsy and loud on the path. He instructed the driver to wait, a small, irrational hope that this might be a brief, preliminary visit from which he could easily retreat. But he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that his belongings were already on their way, and his contract was signed. This place was to be his home and his workplace, a world unto itself governed by a faith he could not comprehend. He was met at the heavy oak door, not by a porter, but by a nurse, whose white linen uniform was so heavily starched, it seemed to crackle with her every movement. Her face was placid, her eyes downcast in a posture of serene humility that the doctor found immediately unsettling. She did not ask his name, but simply stated that the matron was expecting him. The interior of the asylum was a sensory shock. The faint scent of carbolic acid, the familiar and reassuring smell of medical hygiene, was almost completely overwhelmed by the thick, cloying aroma of incense. It was the scent of a cathedral, not a clinic. The corridors were long and bare, their stone walls scrubbed clean and lit by the flickering, unsteady glow of candles placed in iron sconces. The light threw long dancing shadows that seemed to hide more than they revealed. The distant sound of the hymn grew louder here, a chorus of female voices singing in a slow, mournful cadence that echoed through the vaulted hallways. There were no shouts, no screams, no sounds of distress that one would expect from an institution housing the mentally unwell. The silence between the musical phrases was absolute, a disciplined void that spoke of an iron will imposing itself upon the chaos of madness. The nurse led him to the matron's office, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished stone floors. She walked with a strange gliding motion, her hands clasped before her, as if in constant prayer. The doctor's own footsteps seemed to thunder in the oppressive quiet. He passed patients in the hallway, all women, dressed in simple gray frocks. They did not meet his gaze. Instead, they were engaged in simple, repetitive tasks, polishing floors, mending linens, their movements slow and methodical, their faces vacant. They seemed less like patients receiving treatment and more like members of a silent religious order, lost in a state of perpetual, meditative labor. There was a profound lack of individuality, a uniformity that chilled him more than any overt sign of insanity could have. He was a man who believed in the uniqueness of every human mind, even in its broken state. What he saw here was not healing, but erasure. Matron Agatha Pell's office was the heart of this strange domain. It was a sparse room, dominated by a large, dark wood desk and a single, high-backed chair where she sat, framed by a tall window that looked out onto a walled garden. She was a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the asylum itself. Her face was severe, etched with lines of sorrow and conviction, but her eyes held a startling, luminous intensity. She was dressed in the simple black attire of a widow, unadorned save for a large, silver rosary that hung from her waist, its crucifix catching the candlelight. She did not rise to greet him, but simply gestured to the chair opposite her desk. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and resonant, a voice accustomed to being obeyed without being raised. She welcomed Dr. Wren to St. Aurelia, her words formal and precise. She explained that their methods were perhaps different from what he was accustomed to. Here, she told him, they did not see madness as a disease of the brain, but as a sickness of the soul. The cure, therefore, lay not in pharmaceuticals or invasive procedures, but in penance, prayer, and a return to divine order. She spoke of her own divine visions, describing them not with the feverish energy of a fanatic, but with the calm certainty of a scholar discussing an established fact. God, she explained, had spoken to her in her darkest hour and had given her a sacred charge to create a new kind of sanctuary, a place where purity could be restored. Dr. Wren listened, his scientific mind rebelling against every word. He tried to steer the conversation toward medicine, to discuss patient histories, diagnoses, and treatment plans. He spoke of neurology, of the delicate chemistry of the mind. The matron listened patiently, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. When he was finished, she simply stated that his science was a tool, a useful but limited way of understanding God's creation. The true work, she insisted, was spiritual, and it was work she oversaw personally. She informed him that his duties would be to tend to the physical ailments of the patients, to ensure their bodies were healthy vessels. The care of their souls, she made it clear, was her domain alone. As she spoke, the doctor's gaze drifted to the window behind her. In the walled garden below, two figures were working, turning over the soil with heavy shovels. They were tall, powerfully built men, dressed in simple, dark work clothes. They moved with a synchronized, silent efficiency, their heads bowed to their task. The doctor asked who they were. The matron's expression softened for the first time, a flicker of maternal pride in her intense eyes. She identified them as her sons, Lucien and Caleb. They were good boys, she said, devoted to the asylum and its holy mission. They had been born here, and they had never left. The doctor found this detail profoundly strange. Two healthy, grown men who had never ventured beyond the asylum walls. He pressed for more information, asking about their lives, their role in the institution. The matron's response was evasive. She said they served God in their own way, that their work was a form of prayer, and that their presence was a comfort to the patients. Her words were meant to reassure, but they had the opposite effect. They created a new, darker layer to the mystery of Saint Aurelia. The image of the two silent brothers, toiling endlessly in a sealed garden, lingered in his mind long after he was dismissed from the matron's presence. A nurse was assigned to show him to his quarters, a small, ascetic room not much different from a monk's cell. As they walked through the corridors, the evening prayers began, the same mournful hymns echoing through the stone halls. The doctor paused, listening to the disembodied voices. He asked the nurse about the matron's sons. The nurse's placid expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She told him that Lucien and Caleb were a blessing. She said they were their mother's hands in the world, carrying out the work that was too heavy for others. Her voice was filled with a reverence that sounded rehearsed, a line from a catechism learned by rote. But as she turned to leave, she hesitated for a fraction of a second, and the doctor caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes, a flicker of fear, or perhaps pity. The moment passed, and her mask of serene obedience was back in place. The first few weeks passed in a disorienting haze of routine and quiet observation. Dr. Wren performed his duties, treating minor illnesses and injuries among the patient population. He found the women to be remarkably docile, their madness seemingly smoothed over by the asylum's rigid structure of prayer and labor. Yet, he could not shake the feeling that he was not a doctor in a hospital, but a warden in a very strange, very quiet prison. He rarely saw the matron's sons up close. They remained distant figures, always at the periphery of his vision, mending a stone wall, tending the gardens, or silently carrying supplies into the asylum's lower levels. They never spoke, at least not where he could hear. They moved through the world of Saint Aurelia like ghosts, their purpose known only to their mother. The whispers he had hoped to gather from the staff were non-existent. The nurses and orderlies were as disciplined and uncommunicative as the patients, their loyalty to the matron absolute. They deflected his questions with scripture or polite non-answers, their faces impenetrable masks of faith. The asylum was a closed system, a world with its own logic, its own truths, and its own secrets. The core question began to solidify in the doctor's mind. What kind of faith sustained this place? It was not the compassionate, forgiving faith he had read about in his youth. This was something different, something colder and more demanding. It felt more like an ancient, pre-Christian cult than a modern asylum. The entire institution revolved around the singular will of Matron Agatha Pell, her visions treated as divine law. The asylum was not a hospital that happened to be run by a religious woman. It was a temple, a monastery dedicated to a god of her own creation, and the patients were her unwilling acolytes. His scientific mind, trained to search for patterns and evidence, began to work, almost against his will. He started to observe more closely, to document the small, anomalous details that disrupted the asylum's placid surface. The way certain patients were singled out for private prayer sessions with the matron, the fact that all the patients were women of childbearing age, the rhythmic clicking of the matron's rosary beads, a sound that seemed to precede any significant event in the asylum's daily schedule. The transition from a general, atmospheric unease to a specific medical investigation began subtly. It was during a routine examination of a young woman admitted for what her family had called religious hysteria. She was quiet, withdrawn, and physically healthy, by all appearances. But as Dr. Wren conducted his examination, he noted a distinct tenderness in her abdomen and a slight swelling of her breasts. They were the unmistakable early signs of pregnancy. He made a note in his private ledger, dismissing it initially as a condition that must have begun prior to her admittance. But then, a week later, he observed the same symptoms in another patient, a woman who had been at the asylum for nearly a year. He cross-referenced the asylum's official records, but found no mention of these conditions. The medical files were sparse, focusing more on spiritual progress than on physical pathology. He began to conduct his own examinations more discreetly, during the late hours when the asylum was draped in its deepest silence. He discovered a third patient, and then a fourth. A terrifying pattern was beginning to emerge, an impossible biological fact in this isolated, all-female environment. The women were sequestered, cut off from the outside world entirely. The only men on the grounds were himself, a few elderly groundskeepers, and the two silent, ever-present sons of the matron. The mystery of Saint Aurelia was no longer a matter of faith and madness. It was becoming a question of flesh and blood. The asylum, he was beginning to realize, was not just a place where reason went to die. It was a place where something else was being born. The doctor's suspicions, once a form of free-floating anxiety, now began to coalesce into a single, horrifying hypothesis. His training had taught him to trust empirical evidence above all else, and the evidence was presenting itself in the most undeniable of forms, the quiet, physiological transformation of the women under his care. These were not isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a biological anomaly that defied all logic within the cloistered walls of Saint Aurelia. To confirm his growing fears, he knew he needed more than his own private examinations. He needed access to the asylum's history, to the patient records that the matron kept under lock and key. He understood that a direct request would be met with pious deflection or outright refusal. The matron guarded her secrets as fiercely as she guarded her faith, and he was beginning to understand that they were one and the same. His investigation, therefore, had to become a clandestine operation, an act of scientific heresy within this stone cathedral of madness. He waited for the deepest point of the night, that hour before dawn when the asylum was at its most still, when the prayers had ceased and the only sounds were the settling of the old building and the distant sigh of the wind. Armed with a single candle and a set of purloined keys, he made his way to the administrative wing. The flame cast his shadow long and distorted against the walls, making him feel like a trespasser in a sacred tomb. The matron's office was locked, as he expected, but a smaller, adjacent room served as the asylum's archives. The lock was old and stiff, but it yielded with a painful groan of metal that sounded to the doctor like a gunshot in the profound silence. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the asylum, and smelled of decaying paper, leather, and the dry, dusty scent of forgotten time. Shelves reached from the floor to the ceiling, crammed with leather-bound ledgers and stacks of bundled files tied with faded ribbon. This was the recorded history of Saint Aurelia, the official narrative of every soul who had passed through its gates. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, his fingers, numb with cold, tracing the handwritten labels on the spines of the ledgers. He was searching for medical notes, for any records that predated his own arrival. He pulled down a volume from 5 years prior, its pages brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was not the matron's severe, angular script, but a more elegant, looping hand that he recognized from the signature on his own contract as belonging to the asylum's previous physician. He scanned the entries, his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light. At first, he found nothing unusual, just routine notes on melancholia, hysteria, and various physical ailments. But then he found it, a brief, almost coded entry about a young patient. The physician had noted a diagnosis of pregnancy, followed by a series of question marks. A week later, another entry for the same patient noted that the matron had taken over her spiritual care entirely. And then, a final chilling note. The patient had been, in the asylum's parlance, delivered unto God's mercy. A euphemism, the doctor now realized, for death. A cold dread, far deeper than the chill of the room, settled into his bones. He pulled down another ledger, and then another. The pattern repeated itself with sickening regularity over the years. A patient would be diagnosed with pregnancy by the previous doctor, his notes clinical and concerned. In every single case, the matron would intervene, citing the need for specialized spiritual guidance. The medical records would then cease, replaced by the matron's own script, which spoke not of medicine, but of grace. He found the phrase again and again, scrawled in her severe, confident hand. The patient had been touched by grace. These women, she wrote, had been chosen. They were no longer simply patients, they were vessels. There were no records of births, no mention of children. There were only accounts of these women being secluded for a period of months in the asylum's lower wards, followed by a brief, sanitized note of their passing, their souls purified and returned to the Creator. The official causes of death were listed as fever or consumption, or a simple failure of a constitution weakened by madness. But Dr. Wren, reading between the lines, saw a graveyard of hidden data. He was not just uncovering a series of pregnancies, he was uncovering a series of murders, all meticulously documented and cloaked in the language of salvation. His search was interrupted by a sound from the corridor, the faint, rhythmic click, click, click of rosary beads. It was the matron. He hastily replaced the ledgers, his heart hammering against his ribs. He blew out the candle and pressed himself into the deepest shadows of the room, praying the old lock would hold, that she would not think to check it. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by the soft rustle of her black dress. She passed the archive door without pausing, her footsteps continuing down the hall toward the chapel for her own pre-dawn vigil. The doctor waited, his breath held tight in his chest, until the sound faded completely. He had the evidence, the written proof of a long-standing systematic horror. But what did it mean? How was it possible? The question of paternity remained a blank, terrifying void in his understanding. He returned to his room as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through his window. The ledger's ghostly contents burned into his memory. He knew that the asylum's placid surface was a lie, and that beneath it lay a truth so monstrous it could only be sustained by the most absolute and terrifying form of faith. The confirmation of his fears did not come from a hidden document, but from the mouth of the matron herself, delivered from the pulpit of the asylum's chapel. Attendance at Sunday service was mandatory for all staff and ambulatory patients. Dr. Wren took his place in a rear pew, observing the scene with the detached eye of a clinician studying a mass delusion. The chapel was cold, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and incense. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of martyrdom, casting jewels of colored light onto the pale, upturned faces of the female patients. The matron stood at the lectern, not as a caregiver, but as a high priestess. Her presence filled the room, her voice low and hypnotic. Her sermon that morning was on the nature of purity. She spoke of the world outside the asylum's walls as a fallen, corrupted place, a world where the blood of humanity had been tainted by sin and weakness. She described Saint Aurelia not as a place of healing, but as an ark, a vessel built to carry the last remnants of purity through a flood of spiritual decay. Then, her tone shifted, becoming more intense, more fervent. Her eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire as she leaned forward, her gaze sweeping over the assembled women. She declared that God had granted her a vision, a new covenant. She spoke of a great and holy duty that had been bestowed upon the asylum. It was their task, she proclaimed, to create a new generation, a holy bloodline free from the sins of the past. God's seed, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried to every corner of the chapel, must be purified, and it must be sown in chosen vessels, in women whose souls had been cleansed of worldly corruption by suffering and penance. The patients listened, their expressions rapt and uncomprehending, their minds too fractured or too medicated to grasp the true meaning of her words. But the staff, the nurses, and the orderlies, they understood. They sat with their heads bowed, their hands clasped in their laps, their faces betraying nothing but pious acceptance. They were not just employees, they were believers. Dr. Wren felt a wave of nausea. This was not theology, it was a manifesto. The matron was not speaking in metaphors. She was describing a program of eugenics, cloaked in the language of divine will. And as she spoke, he saw her two sons, Lucian and Caleb, standing in the shadows near the altar. They were dressed in black, their large forms still and watchful, their faces as impassive as stone. The matron's sermon reached its crescendo. She raised her hands, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. She declared that the wombs of the chosen were to be consecrated, made holy for the sacred work ahead. They were to be the mothers of a new kind of man, and their children would be the first fruits of a world restored to grace. The doctor looked from the matron on the pulpit to her two silent sons standing by the altar, and the final, unthinkable piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His mind, trained in logic and reason, recoiled from the conclusion, yet the evidence was irrefutable. The impossible pregnancies, the talk of purified seed, the all-encompassing power of the matron. He finally understood. The source of the divine seed was not divine at all. That evening, driven by a desperate need for confirmation, he sought out one of the nurses. He chose a senior nurse, a woman who had been at the asylum for over a decade, whose face, though usually a mask of professional calm, sometimes betrayed a deep, weary sadness in her eyes. He had once treated her for a severe burn on her arm, an injury she had received while trying to prevent a patient from self-harming, and in that moment he had seen a brief flicker of genuine humanity, of a compassion not dictated by the matron's doctrine. He found her alone in the infirmary, sterilizing instruments by the light of a gas lamp. The room smelled of alcohol and carbolic acid, a small island of science in the asylum's ocean of faith. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke in a low, urgent voice, his words precise and clinical. He told her about the pregnancies he had discovered, about the pattern he had found in the old records. He asked her how it was possible. The nurse did not look at him. She continued her work, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm, but he could see a fine tremor in her fingers. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken horror. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She told him that he did not understand. She said that what happened at St. Aurelia was God's will, and it was not for them to question it. She said the matron was a living saint, and that she communed with angels. The doctor pressed her, his voice hard. He said he was a man of medicine, and this was not the work of angels. He asked her who the fathers were. The nurse finally stopped her work. She turned to face him, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it seemed to extinguish the lamplight. She looked over her shoulder, down the dark, empty corridor, as if expecting to see a phantom. She leaned closer, and the scent of fear was sharp on her breath. She told him there were no fathers here. She said there were only instruments of God's grace. She whispered that the sons, Lucien and Caleb, were not men. They were more than men. They were, she said, the angels who served their mother's holy vision. She said they were the ones who brought God's blessing to the chosen vessels. The confirmation, when it came, was worse than anything he could have imagined. It was not just a crime he had uncovered. It was a sacrament. The matron's twisted doctrine was a literal, physical reality, enacted in the hidden corners of the asylum by her own sons upon the most vulnerable of her charges. The senior nurse's words hung in the air, a blasphemy disguised as a revelation. Before the doctor could ask another question, she turned away, her brief moment of confession over. She picked up her instruments again, her shoulders hunched. She warned him to stop asking questions. She said that those who questioned God's will here often found themselves in need of the matron's most intensive spiritual care. It was a clear, unambiguous threat. He left the infirmary, the image of the nurse's terrified face seared into his mind. He was no longer just a physician, he was a witness. But he was a witness trapped in a church where the congregation was blind and the high priestess was mad, and her angels were monsters. The final piece of this initial stage of his investigation came not from a record or a conversation, but from a tragedy. He was summoned late one night to a patient's room. It was one of the young women he had identified as being pregnant. She had attempted to take her own life, a desperate act of violence against herself and the life that was growing within her. They managed to save her, but she was lost in a state of catatonia, her mind having retreated to a place where no one could reach it. In the moments before she had lost consciousness, however, she had managed to scrawl a message, a few desperate words on a scrap of paper clutched in her hand. A nurse had found it, and, in a moment of panic or perhaps conscience, had given it to the doctor before the matron could be summoned. The note was barely legible, the pencil strokes erratic and faint. It was not a confession or a plea. It was a prayer. It asked God for forgiveness, and at the bottom, it named the ones she believed had brought her this unwanted miracle, this terrifying grace. She had not called them rapists or assailants. She had called them by the names the matron had taught her to use. She had called them her deliverers, Lucien and Caleb. The evidence was now absolute. The doctor folded the piece of paper, the fragile artifact of a soul's destruction, and knew that his time as a quiet observer was over. He had to become an investigator, a chronicler of this atrocity, before Saint Aurelia claimed another vessel for its profane gospel. The small, crumpled note was a catalyst. It transformed Dr. Elias Wren from a passive chronicler of atrocities into an active pursuer of their source. The words of the suicidal patient, naming the matron's sons as her deliverers, had closed the circuit of his investigation, connecting the matron's profane theology to the physical violation of her patients. He knew, with the certainty of a pathologist identifying a disease, that the asylum's most profound secret was not contained in its archives, but in its architecture. The whispers he had overheard from the staff, the coded references in the old ledgers, they all pointed downward, to the asylum's forbidden lower levels, a place that did not appear on any of the official floor plans. He had seen the sons descend into that darkness with supplies, and he had seen the matron follow, her rosary clicking like a key turning in a lock. It was there, he was certain, that the doctrine of divine conception was made flesh. His opportunity came on a moonless night, when the asylum was shrouded in a thick, wet fog that muffled all sound and clung to the granite walls like a second skin. He had been watching the sons for days, noting the rhythm of their movements, the strange, silent rituals that governed their lives. He saw them leave the main hall after the final evening prayer, carrying not tools or cleaning supplies, but a covered metal tray and a small, locked medical case. They moved with a purpose that was different from their usual, plodding labor. This was not maintenance, this was a procedure. The doctor followed at a safe distance, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold stone. He stayed in the shadows, a ghost in his own place of work, his heart a cold, tight knot in his chest. The brothers did not speak to each other. Their communication was a thing of gestures and shared, unspoken understanding, the product of a lifetime of insular devotion. They stopped before a heavy iron door in a disused service corridor, a door he had previously assumed led to nothing more than a coal cellar. One of the sons, Lucian, produced a large, archaic key and turned it in the lock. The sound was a low, grating groan that seemed to travel directly up the doctor's spine. The door swung inward, revealing not a cellar, but a steep, narrow staircase descending into absolute blackness. A wave of foul air washed up from the opening, a rank combination of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and a faint, coppery tang that the doctor recognized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was the smell of blood. The brothers descended, their lantern casting a weak, bobbing circle of light that was quickly swallowed by the oppressive dark. Dr. Wren waited, counting to 100, his mind a battlefield of professional duty and primal fear. Then, he followed them into the earth. The stairs were slick with a film of dampness, and the air grew colder with each step. The distant, muted sounds of the upper asylum faded away, replaced by a profound, subterranean silence. As he reached the bottom, he found himself in a long, vaulted cellar, its ceiling low and arched like the crypt of a church. The air was thick and difficult to breathe. He extinguished his own small lantern, relying on the faint, distant glow from the brothers' light further down the corridor. He could hear new sounds now, faint and rhythmic. It was the low, steady cadence of chanting, and beneath it, the unmistakable sound of a woman's soft, rhythmic moaning. He moved forward, pressing himself against the damp stone wall. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, and what he saw there would forever sever him from the world of conventional medicine and rational thought. It was a makeshift maternity ward, a secret hospital dedicated to the matron's monstrous gospel, but it was a place of horror, not healing. Along the walls were a half-dozen iron-framed beds, and in each bed lay a woman in a state of advanced pregnancy. They were the chosen vessels, the patients who had been touched by grace. They were not restrained with leather straps, but with thin iron chains at their wrists and ankles, the metal gleaming dully in the sparse candlelight. The chains were not tight, but they were secure, tethering these women to their beds like sacrifices chained to an altar. They were in various states of consciousness, their heads lolling to the side, their eyes glazed over with the effects of what the doctor could only assume was a powerful sedative, likely laudanum. A sticky, fragrant oil had been used to draw a small, crude cross on each of their foreheads, the mark of their consecration. In the center of the room, Matron Agatha Pell stood before a small, makeshift altar upon which sat a single candle and an open Bible. She was the source of the chanting, her voice a low, hypnotic drone, reciting psalms of creation in Latin. She held her large silver rosary, her thumb and forefinger moving from bead to bead with a relentless, steady rhythm. Her sons, Lucian and Caleb, moved about the room with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was profoundly chilling. They were no longer groundskeepers. Here, in their mother's subterranean temple, they were acolytes, medical orderlies, and something far, far worse. They checked on the sedated women, their large hands surprisingly gentle as they adjusted a blanket or wiped a feverish brow. They seemed to see no contradiction in their actions, no conflict between their role as violators and their role as caregivers. To them, it was all part of the same holy work, the same sacred duty to their mother's God. The doctor's attention was drawn to the far end of the chamber, where one bed was separated from the others by a linen screen. The moaning was coming from behind it, growing in intensity and frequency. A birth was imminent. He watched, frozen in a state of horrified fascination, as the matron ceased her chanting and moved toward the screen, her sons following a pace behind her. She was no longer just a priestess. She was now the midwife. The doctor, a man of science, felt an overwhelming perverse need to witness this, to document it with his own eyes. This was the central sacrament of the matron's faith, the moment her abstract doctrine became a biological reality. He crept closer, finding a tear in an old tapestry that hung against the wall, allowing him a partial, horrifying view of the scene unfolding behind the screen. The young woman on the bed was fully conscious, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and terror. The doctor recognized her as one of the patients he had examined weeks ago. She was in the final stages of labor. The matron stood at the foot of the bed, her Bible now in one hand, her voice no longer chanting, but speaking in a calm, commanding tone. She was not offering words of comfort, but words of scripture, coaching the young woman through her contractions with verses from the book of Genesis. She spoke of Eve's sin and the pain of childbirth as a holy penance. Her sons worked at her side. Lucien held the woman's hand, not in a gesture of comfort, but of restraint, his grip firm and unyielding. Caleb prepared cloths and a basin of water, his movements as precise and devoid of emotion as a surgeon's assistant. From the distant upper levels of the asylum, the faint, ethereal sound of the chapel organ could be heard, one of the nurses likely playing a late-night canticle, the sound drifting down into this unholy space as a grotesque and ironic hymn. The birth itself was a swift, brutal affair. The matron's voice never wavered, her recitation of scripture continuing as the woman's cries turned into screams. The air became thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and blood, a primal scent that mixed with the lingering odor of candle smoke and incense. And then, the cry of a newborn infant, thin and sharp in the heavy, subterranean air. The matron's work was not done. With the same ritualistic gravity, she took the child, cleaned it, and wrapped it in a white linen cloth. She made the sign of the cross on its forehead with the same holy oil she used on its mother. She then turned, her face illuminated by the candlelight, and for the first time, the doctor saw a look of pure, ecstatic triumph in her eyes. It was a look of a creator gazing upon her creation. She held the infant up, a small, squirming bundle, and presented it to her sons. She proclaimed that creation had been restored, that a new life, pure and untainted, had been brought into the world through their sacred obedience. She gave the infant to Lucien, who held it with an awkward, unfamiliar reverence. The doctor had seen enough. He felt a profound, physical sickness, a revulsion so complete it threatened to overwhelm him. This was not a birth, it was a harvest. These women were not mothers, they were vessels, used and then, as the old records suggested, discarded when their purpose was served. And the children? What became of them? This question opened a new, even darker chasm of possibility in his mind. He backed away from the tapestry, his mind reeling. The question of divine authority had been answered. The matron's power was entirely self-granted, born from a madness so profound that it had not only consumed her, but had successfully sanctified itself, convincing all those around her that her blasphemy was God's own will. He had witnessed the truth behind her words, the horrifying, visceral reality of her gospel. He made his way back through the darkness of the crypt, his scientific detachment shattered, replaced by a cold, burning rage. He knew his testimony alone would not be enough. Who would believe such a story? It was the word of one man against a woman whom the world outside saw as a living saint. He needed more. He needed to understand the genesis of this madness, the psychological architecture that had allowed such a belief to take root and flourish. He needed proof, not just of the crime, but of the motive, the origin of the delusion. As he emerged from the cellar, back into the quiet, hallowed corridors of the main asylum, a new objective formed in his mind. He had to get inside the matron's private world, inside her mind. He knew of only one place where such a thing might be recorded. He had seen it on her desk, a large, leather-bound volume that was always present, always closed. It was her personal journal. He would have to steal it. The act would be an unforgivable trespass, a violation of her most private sanctum. But after what he had just witnessed, he knew that some sins were necessary. The visceral horror of the forbidden ward had stripped away the last vestiges of Dr. Elias Wren's professional detachment. He was no longer dealing with a mere case of religious fanaticism, but with a living, breathing system of ritualized abuse, a theology constructed to sanctify a monstrous crime. His rage was a cold, precise instrument, but he knew that rage alone was powerless against the fortress of faith the matron had built around herself. To dismantle it, he needed to understand its foundations. He needed the key to her mind, the original text of her gospel, and that text was her private journal. The theft required a level of audacity that went against his every instinct. He was a man of quiet observation, not of action, but the screams of the woman in the birthing room had become a permanent echo in his memory, a moral imperative that could not be ignored. He waited 2 nights, allowing the rhythm of the asylum to settle, allowing any suspicion that might have been cast by his nocturnal wanderings to dissipate. A storm was rolling in from the coast, a fitting accomplice for the task ahead. The sky grew dark, the air heavy with the smell of rain and wet earth, and the first rumbles of distant thunder provided a cloak for his movements. He made his way to her office during the hour of vespers, knowing the entire asylum staff and a majority of the patients would be gathered in the chapel, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic chant. The matron's office was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, the nerve center of her authority. He had anticipated a complex lock, but the door was held by a simple latch. It was a testament to her absolute belief in the loyalty of her flock. It would never occur to her that one of them would dare to trespass. He slipped inside, the closing of the door silencing the distant hymns, plunging him into a pocket of profound quiet. The room was just as he remembered it, severe, orderly, and dominated by her imposing desk. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, lingering scent of her person, a dry, almost floral aroma that he now found repulsive. The rain began to fall in earnest, lashing against the tall window pane, the sound like a frantic, desperate tapping. It was the only sound in the room, a frantic counterpoint to the steady, terrified beating of his own heart. The journal lay on the desk, precisely in the center. It was a large, heavy volume bound in black leather, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. There was no lock, no clasp. Its secrets were protected not by metal, but by the sheer force of her will. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. It felt strangely warm, as if it still held the heat of her hands. He knew he could not read it here. Time was a luxury he did not have. Tucking the heavy book inside his coat, he moved to the window, his mind racing. He could not simply walk back to his room. A chance encounter in the hallway would be impossible to explain. He looked down at the walled garden 2 stories below, the same garden where he had first seen her sons at work. A thick, ancient ivy clung to the granite walls. It was a risk, a terrible one, but it was a better option than discovery. He forced the window open, the cool, rain-lashed air a shock to his system. He swung himself out, his feet finding purchase in the thick, gnarled vines, and began his descent, the heavy journal pressed against his chest like a stolen heart. The stone was slick with rain, his city shoes offering little grip, but he made it to the soft, muddy earth of the garden, his body trembling with adrenaline. From there, he slipped back into the asylum through a service entrance, a shadow moving through shadows, until he reached the security of his own small room. He bolted the door and drew the curtains, the sense of violation he felt now mixed with a grim, triumphant resolve. He lit a single candle, its small flame creating an intimate circle of light in the profound darkness. The rain beat a steady, rhythmic tattoo on the chapel roof nearby, a somber drumbeat accompanying his descent into the matron's soul. He opened the journal. The pages were thick parchment, filled with a script that, at first, was elegant and controlled. The early entries, dated more than a decade prior, were what one might expect from a grieving widow. She wrote of her husband, his sudden passing, and the profound, disorienting emptiness of her life. She wrote of her 2 young sons, Lucian and Caleb, and her fears for their future without a father. The prose was melancholic, tinged with a deep and conventional piety. She prayed for guidance, for a purpose to fill the void. A reader, stumbling upon these first pages, would have felt nothing but sympathy for her. This, Dr. Wren realized, was the humanizing detail, the woman she had been before the madness had taken root. But then, the tone began to change. The entries became less frequent, but longer, more intense. Her grief, it seemed, had not lessened, but had curdled, transforming into something else. She began to write of her husband not with sorrow, but with a strange, almost fearful reverence, describing him as a man of great passions and appetites, a man whose presence had been a powerful, overwhelming force in her life. The doctor, reading between the lines of her ornate, scriptural prose, began to see the faint outlines of a different story. She wrote of her duty as a wife, of the need for submission, of the sanctity of a husband's will. It was the language of a woman who had been controlled, dominated, and perhaps abused. She never stated it directly, but the undercurrent of fear and a deep, unexamined sexual guilt was unmistakable. His death, Wren hypothesized, had not just left a void. It had released her from a prison, and the guilt she felt over that sense of release was what had broken her mind. The first mention of a vision came approximately 6 months after her husband's death. The handwriting on this page was different, larger. The ink pressed so hard into the paper that it had bled slightly on the other side. She described being woken in the night by a brilliant white light that filled her room. An angel, she wrote, had stood before her, its face terrible and beautiful. It did not speak of comfort or of peace. It spoke of a covenant. She wrote that the angel had told her the bloodline of man had become weak and corrupted. It told her that her suffering had purified her, made her a worthy instrument for a great and holy work. The angel, she claimed, had commanded her to create a new sanctuary, a place where the wombs of the fallen could be consecrated and made pure again. It was here, in this feverish, frantic script, that the doctor found the foundational phrase of her entire delusion. The angel had commanded her to forge, she wrote, a new covenant between the womb and the word. From that point forward, the journal ceased to be a diary and became a holy text, a record of her divine instructions. The angel visited her often in her writings, each visitation providing a new piece of her grotesque theology. It instructed her on the design of the asylum, on the rules of prayer and penance required to cleanse the souls of her patients. And then came the most terrible revelation of all. The angel, she wrote, had looked upon her sons, Lucian and Caleb, and had declared them to be instruments, their bodies vessels for a holy purpose. They were not to be like other men, tainted by the sins of the world. They were to be kept pure, sequestered within the asylum's walls, their seed preserved for the great work to come. They were to be the physical agents of the new covenant, the deliverers of God's grace to the chosen vessels. She had accepted this command not with horror, but with a terrifying, ecstatic gratitude. It was the purpose she had been praying for. Her grief had been given meaning. Her guilt had been transformed into a holy mission. Her trauma had been sanctified. Dr. Wren had to put the journal down. He felt a wave of vertigo, his clinical mind struggling to impose a diagnosis on what felt like a direct transmission from a disordered soul. It was a classic case of religious psychosis, born from trauma and guilt, and allowed to fester in isolation, unchecked by reason or outside intervention. Her madness was not chaotic, it was architectural. She had built an entire world, a complete theological system, to protect herself from the memory of a cruel husband and the guilt she felt at his death. The asylum was her fortress. The patients were her subjects. Her sons were her holy executioners. He picked up the journal again, his hands now steady, his purpose clear. He read on, through years of entries that documented the slow and methodical implementation of her plan. She wrote of the first vessel with a chilling detachment, describing the ritual of impregnation as a sacred duty, a holy and impersonal act. She recorded the births and the subsequent deaths of the mothers with the same serene, scriptural language, believing she was sending purified souls to God. He found no mention of what became of the infants. The journal, for all its detailed theology, was silent on their fate. This omission was, in its own way, more terrifying than any of the revelations. It was a void in the narrative that suggested a horror she could not, or would not, commit to the page. The core question, can madness sanctify itself through Scripture, was answered in every line of her writing. It could. And in her case, it had created a self-perpetuating engine of atrocity, a system where faith was the justification for unspeakable acts, and Scripture was the shield that deflected all guilt. He finally closed the book as the first hints of a gray, storm-washed dawn appeared at the edges of his curtain. The weight of what he had read settled upon him, a physical and spiritual burden. He now understood the origin of the evil that saturated Saint Aurelia, but knowledge, he was beginning to realize, was not the same as power. He looked out his window. The rain had stopped, and the asylum was beginning to stir. He saw a nurse crossing the courtyard, her head bowed in prayer. He saw one of the orderlies beginning his morning rounds. He saw them not as asylum staff, but as the matron's disciples, their faces masks of serene, unshakable faith. They were all loyal believers. To them, he was the outsider, the man of secular science, the potential heretic. He had stolen their high priestess's most sacred text. He held the proof of her madness in his hands, but what could he do with it? Who could he show it to? To present this journal would be to declare war on their entire world, on their very understanding of God. He was no longer an investigator. He was a threat. His knowledge had not made him a savior. It had made him a blasphemer in the heart of a madwoman's church. His mission was no longer about exposure. It had become a desperate, terrifying struggle for survival. The possession of the matron's journal was a dangerous and double-edged sword. It was the irrefutable proof of her madness. Yet its absence from her desk was a silent alarm, a ticking clock that measured the final moments of Dr. Wren's precarious freedom. He knew she would discover its loss soon, and her response would be swift and absolute. For 3 days, he lived in a state of heightened, paranoid vigilance, the heavy book concealed beneath a loose floorboard in his room. He went about his duties with a manufactured calm, his every interaction with the staff, a calculated performance of normalcy. But he saw the change in the atmosphere. There was a new tension in the air, a watchfulness in the eyes of the nurses. The matron herself had withdrawn, seen only during chapel services, where she delivered sermons of escalating, apocalyptic fervor. She spoke of a coming purification, of the need to cast out the serpent from the garden, of a final, glorious trial by fire that would separate the faithful from the unbelievers. Her eyes, when they swept over the congregation, seemed to linger on him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was not speaking in metaphor. She was preparing her flock for a purge. The doctor's plan was simple and desperate. He had to escape St. Aurelia, not just with his life, but with the journal. He had to reach the authorities in the nearest town, to present them with this testament of horror and force an intervention. He spent his nights meticulously planning his route, studying the asylum's outer walls from his window, identifying the weakest point in its perimeter. But the matron's own plans were moving faster than his. On the 4th night, his world contracted to the size of his small Spartan room. He was working late, transcribing his own notes, when he heard the heavy, synchronized tread of footsteps in the corridor. There was no knock. The lock on his door, a flimsy, inadequate thing, splintered inward, and the door swung open. The matron's 2 sons, Lucian and Caleb, filled the doorway, their large frames blocking out the candlelight from the hall. For the first time, he was seeing them up close, not as distant laborers or silent acolytes, but as instruments of their mother's will. Their faces were blank, impassive, their eyes holding no malice, only a placid and terrifying certainty. Behind them, in the shadows of the hall, he could see the matron, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He didn't have time to react. They moved with a swift, brutal efficiency. One pinned his arms while the other overturned his meager furniture, the contents of his room crashing to the floor. They were searching. They ripped his mattress open, tore his books from their shelves, their movements methodical and relentless. And then, one of them found the loose floorboard. Lucian reached down and produced the journal, holding it up for his mother to see. The matron stepped into the room, her presence sucking the very air from the space. She took the book from her son's hand, clutching it to her chest like a rescued child. She looked at the doctor, and her eyes, which had always held the fire of fanaticism, now glowed with the cold, hard light of judgment. She did not raise her voice. She spoke in a low, even tone that was more terrifying than any shout. She called him a Judas, a blasphemer who had defiled a sacred text. She told him that he, with his secular science and his faithless questions, was the corruption she had been sent to purify. She informed him that his presence at St. Aurelia was no accident. It was a trial, sent by God to test the strength of her faith, and it was a trial she intended to pass. He was not taken to a conventional cell. He was dragged down to the forbidden lower levels, to the damp, foul-smelling crypt that housed her secret maternity ward. The pregnant, sedated women were still there, their rhythmic breathing the only sound in the oppressive silence. They locked him in a small, windowless storage room, its only furnishing a single wooden stool. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, the faint, sweet scent of decay. He was left in absolute darkness, the heavy thud of the iron bolt on the other side of the door sealing his fate. He was no longer a doctor or an investigator. He was a heretic, imprisoned in the heart of the Inquisition, awaiting his sentence. Time lost its meaning in the dark. He did not know if hours or days had passed. His only connection to the world above was the distant, muffled sound of the asylum's bells, tolling for morning and evening prayers. And then, a new sound began. It was the sound of activity, of voices raised not in prayer, but in preparation. The faint scent of incense grew stronger, mixed now with the aroma of beeswax and something else, something green and resinous, like freshly cut pine. The door to his cell was finally opened. It was the matron, holding a single candle, her face illuminated from below, making her features seem like a carved, demonic mask. She told him that the hour of purification had come. She said that a grand ceremony was to be held in the chapel, a mass baptism to wash away the sins of the world and welcome a new age of purity. All of her faithful, she said, staff and patients alike, would be gathered to witness the final affirmation of her covenant. She informed him that he, the great doubter, would be granted the privilege of bearing witness as well. He was not to be a participant. He was to be an object lesson, the blasphemer whose punishment would serve as the ultimate testament to her power and her God's divine will. Her sons led him from the cell, his hands bound behind him. The entire asylum was in a state of feverish, ecstatic energy. The corridors were decorated with boughs of pine, and the scent of incense was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Patients, dressed in clean white gowns, were being led by the nurses toward the chapel, their faces a mixture of confusion and placid obedience. They were like lambs being led to a ritual they could not comprehend. The chapel was transformed. Every candle in the asylum had been brought here, their combined light creating a brilliant, shimmering spectacle. The air was hot and close, and the stained glass windows seemed to weep with condensation. The pews were filled with the patients and the staff, a silent, expectant congregation. At the front of the chapel, before the altar, stood a large, ornate baptismal font that the doctor had never seen before. It was filled to the brim with water, and floating on its surface were petals of white roses. The matron took her place at the pulpit, her stolen journal in her hands. She began to speak, her voice ringing with an apocalyptic power. She read passages from her own writings, presenting her delusions as divine scripture. She proclaimed her sons, who stood on either side of the font, as the instruments of a divine inheritance, the fathers of a new and holy generation. Her sermon was a declaration of war on the fallen world and a promise of a new creation, born from the consecrated wombs of her chosen vessels. As she spoke, Dr. Wren, who had been forced to his knees near the side of the altar, saw his chance. In the feverish, ritualistic atmosphere, all attention was on the matron. The guards, local men hired for their muscle and their simple faith, were as enthralled as the rest of the congregation. During the journey from his cell, he had managed, through a painful and desperate effort, to loosen the ropes that bound his wrists. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he broke free. He did not run for the chapel doors. He knew he would never make it. Instead, he ran in the opposite direction, toward the small sacristy behind the altar. He knew from his brief explorations of the asylum that the sacristy had a second, smaller door that led to a service corridor, a corridor that ran directly above the subterranean ward where he had been imprisoned. His escape caused a momentary chaotic uproar. The matron's sermon stopped. She screamed for her sons to seize him, her voice for the first time losing its controlled, hypnotic quality and cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. But the doctor was faster. He slammed the sacristy door shut, bolting it from the inside. He could hear them pounding on the other side, the heavy wood groaning under the force of their blows. He did not waste a second. He found the service door and plunged into the dark, narrow corridor beyond. He had no weapon, no clear plan of escape. He had only one desperate, all-consuming thought. If he was going to die, he would not die alone. This temple of madness had to burn. He made his way through the darkness, his hands tracing the cold stone wall, until he was directly above the hidden maternity ward. He could smell the foul, stagnant air rising through the floorboards. In the corridor were stored the tools of the asylum's maintenance: tins of oil, rags, and cleaning spirits. It was a tinderbox. He worked with a frantic, desperate speed, his actions driven by a cold, clear-eyed fury. He poured the flammable liquids onto the dry, ancient floorboards, stuffing oil-soaked rags into the gaps. He found a discarded box of matches, their sulfurous smell a promise of purification by fire. He struck the first match. The flame flared to life, a small, beautiful, terrible thing in the darkness. He dropped it onto the saturated rags. The fire did not start slowly. It exploded, a whoosh of orange and yellow light that raced down the corridor, feeding on the fuel he had provided. The old wood of the asylum, dry as bone, caught instantly. Smoke, thick and black, began to fill the narrow space. The heat was immense. He knew he had only moments. He scrambled back the way he came, not toward the chapel, but further down the corridor, toward a small ventilation shaft he had noticed earlier, a shaft that he prayed led to the outside. Behind him, he could hear the roar of the fire, the sound of a beast awakening, and beneath him, through the floor, he heard the first terrified screams of the women trapped in the ward below. The asylum's bells began to toll, no longer for prayer, but in a frantic, chaotic alarm. The fire was spreading with an unnatural speed, the old building a perfect vessel for its own destruction. The carefully ordered world of St. Aurelia was collapsing into chaos. Hymns turned to screams. The scent of incense was replaced by the acrid smell of burning faith. He reached the shaft and pulled himself up, the rough stone tearing at his hands. He emerged onto the roof of a lower wing, choking, his lungs burning, the night air a sweet, glorious relief. Below him, the asylum was a vision of hell. Flames licked from the chapel windows, the stained glass martyrs melting in the heat. Staff and patients were streaming out onto the lawns, their white gowns and uniforms stark against the fiery backdrop. He looked for the matron. He saw her, not among the fleeing, but standing on the steps of the burning chapel, her arms outstretched, her face turned up to the flames as if welcoming a divine embrace. She was not screaming. She was praying, her voice lost in the roar of the inferno, a high priestess in the heart of her own funeral pyre. She had promised her followers a purification by fire, and the faith she had created was now being consumed by it. The question of what remains when faith burns was being answered before his eyes. And the answer, he saw, was not mercy, but a terrible and absolute judgment. The inferno that consumed St. Aurelia Asylum did not cleanse the land. It cauterized it, sealing the truth beneath a layer of ash and sanctified myth. Dr. Elias Wren survived the fire, but survival is a relative term. He escaped the flames only to find himself in a different kind of prison, one made not of stone and iron, but of disbelief and institutional silence. He stumbled from the woods at dawn, his face blackened with soot, his lungs raw, the images of the burning chapel and the matron's final, prayerful silhouette seared into his mind. He was a man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had been lit by holy fire. The official investigation that followed was a study in willful blindness. The local constabulary, overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy and deferential to the church authorities who had overseen the asylum, were content to accept the simplest narrative. It was a terrible accident, they concluded, a stray candle from the evening's special service, a tragedy that had claimed the life of a woman they were already beginning to call a saint. The surviving staff, the matron's loyal disciples, were the primary witnesses, and their testimony was a unified chorus of hagiography. They spoke of the doctor's strange behavior in the preceding weeks, of his obsessive questions, of his reclusive nature. They spoke of the matron's final heroic act, claiming she had perished while trying to lead her patients to safety. In the absence of any contradictory evidence, their story became the official record. The few patients who were coherent enough to be questioned could only babble of angels and purification, their words dismissed as the products of minds already broken. The truth was not merely ignored, it was deemed inadmissible from the very beginning. The charred remains of the asylum were sifted for bodies, not for evidence. The death toll was high, but the authorities found no signs of foul play, no reason to question the narrative of a tragic fire. The hidden crypt, the unholy maternity ward, had collapsed in the inferno, its secrets buried under tons of granite and scorched timber. It was as if it had never existed. Dr. Wren, recovering in a small provincial infirmary, knew that his testimony was the only truth that remained. He spent a week, his hands still shaking, his mind a relentless slideshow of horrors, committing everything to paper. He wrote with the cold, dispassionate precision of a scientist authoring a pathology report. He detailed the asylum's atmosphere of oppressive piety, the matron's theology of divine conception, the impossible pattern of pregnancies he had discovered in the archives. He described in visceral, clinical detail the scene he had witnessed in the forbidden ward, the chained women, the ritualistic birth, the role of the matron and her sons. He transcribed, from memory, the most damning passages from her journal, the words that laid bare the psychological architecture of her madness. He included a sworn account of the patient's suicide note, naming Lucien and Caleb as her deliverers. He concluded his report with his own actions, confessing to setting the fire not as an act of arson, but as a desperate, necessary act of cauterization, an attempt to destroy a disease that no other medicine could touch. The final document was over 100 pages long, a meticulous and horrifying case file. He submitted it, along with his formal resignation, to the State Medical Board in Boston. He believed, with the naive faith of a man who still trusted in the institutions of reason, that the evidence was too specific, too detailed, too medically sound to be ignored. He was wrong. He was summoned to a hearing 2 months later. The board convened in a wood-paneled room, its air thick with the smell of old books and self-importance. The members were men of a certain vintage, gray-bearded, somber-suited physicians and clergymen who represented the unshakable pillars of society. They treated him not as a witness, but as a patient. The lead physician, a man renowned for his work on nervous disorders, listened to the doctor's summary of the report with a look of profound, paternalistic pity. He did not question the facts. He questioned the mind that had produced them. He suggested, in a calm and reasonable tone, that Dr. Wren was suffering from a profound psychological trauma. He said it was not uncommon for men of science, when confronted with a tragedy of such magnitude, to invent elaborate narratives to make sense of the chaos. He spoke of hysteria, of delusion, of a mind overwrought by the horrific fire and the loss of life. He pointed to the doctor's own confession of starting the fire as clear evidence of an unstable and unreliable mental state. A clergyman on the board then spoke. He described Matron Agatha Pell as a paragon of Christian charity, a woman whose good works were known throughout the Commonwealth. He said the doctor's accusations were not just unbelievable, they were a form of blasphemy, an attack on the memory of a woman who had died a martyr. The doctor tried to argue, to force them to engage with the evidence, with the patterns, with the medical facts. But it was like shouting at a granite wall. They saw what they wanted to see, a disturbed young doctor and a sainted dead woman. His report was officially sealed, classified as the delusional fantasy of a traumatized physician, and filed away in an archive where it would never see the light of day. He was not censured or charged with a crime. He was simply dismissed, his career over, his voice silenced by the quiet, gentlemanly condescension of men who could not, and would not, believe him. In the months and years that followed, the world moved on, and the myth of Saint Aurelia solidified into accepted history. The local churches, fueled by a surge of charitable donations, began to rebuild on the asylum's old foundations. But it was not to be a hospital for the insane. It was to be a sanctuary, a home for unwed mothers and abandoned children. In a final grotesque act of irony, it was named the St. Agatha Sanctuary for Lost Mothers. Matron Pell was canonized by the local community, her story told and retold in sermons and newspaper articles. She became a local folk saint, the pious widow who had given her life in service to God's most broken children. Her doctrine of divine reproduction, a thing of blood and terror and madness, was forgotten, replaced by a clean, simple story of sacrifice. The asylum she had built as a temple to a monstrous eugenics program was now her monument. Of her sons, Lucian and Caleb, nothing was ever heard again. No bodies matching their description were ever identified in the ruins. They had simply vanished in the chaos of the fire. Ghosts who had served their purpose and retreated back into the shadows from which they came. They left no records, no history, only the lingering, unspoken question of their own monstrous legacy. And what of the children born in the crypt? Their fate remains the most profound and terrible silence in the entire affair. No records of their existence were ever found. It is likely they were quietly given to childless families within the matron's network of faithful, their origins forever concealed, a holy bloodline seeded into the unsuspecting world. The graves of the mothers who died in that subterranean ward, and of the infants who may have perished there, remain unmarked, lost beneath the foundations of the new sanctuary, their stories absorbed into the unhallowed ground. History, it seems, does not always belong to the victim. Sometimes it belongs to the silence. Dr. Elias Wren lived out the rest of his days in obscurity, a small, private practice in a distant state. He never spoke of Saint Aurelia again, but it is said that he kept one copy of his report, the 100 pages of rejected truth, and that he would read it once a year, on the anniversary of the fire, a private ritual of remembrance for the soul's history had chosen to forget. His final, personal reflection, found in a loose note tucked within those pages after his death, serves as the only fitting epitaph for the entire affair. Faith, he had learned, is the asylum where reason goes to die. The evil of Matron Agatha Pell was not defeated by the fire that consumed her. It had simply sanctified itself, using the silence of good men and the machinery of history to transform its own monstrous reflection into the image of a saint. The question of whether evil can be absolved by history is one we must continue to ask. For the answer lies buried in the ashes of places like Saint Aurelia, waiting for those who are willing to look. The case file on Agatha Pell is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.